Hi, my name's Michael Lance. I wanted to go over a science project, if you will, to teach you how to balance your two energy systems when you train, especially as an endurance athlete. When those two systems are balanced, you can go faster, longer. And through the use of science, through blood lactate testing, it will describe these two systems. First of all, let me cover the two energy systems that you have. You have the anaerobic system. I call it the volume of lactate max. This is fed through glycogen and carbohydrates you ingest. Glycogen is stored calories inside of your muscle and inside of your liver. The process of taking glycogen and carbs and moving it down here to pyruvate is called glycolysis. So this system is one of the two energy systems. The second energy system is your aerobic system, often referred to as VO2 max. This and this, they reside in your muscle, but they're two distinct different processes to create ATP, and adenosine triphosphate. So when glycolysis goes on, it's creating a substrate called pyruvate that then moves down into here. This is where oxygen is mixed, why it's called aerobic. Ana is without oxygen. And the mixing of the O2 with pyruvate is what creates energy that your muscle needs to contract and to go. When there's not enough VO2, there's not enough oxygen to metabolize the pyruvate, the excess that's thrown off is called lactate. When you get a buildup of lactate in your muscle, especially when you went way hard, it hurts, and that's because of the negatively charged hydrogen ion that lactate has. So you get this thing called acidosis. And what happens in that process is, in other words, when you get lactate buildup, it's this system is either too strong and produced more pyruvate than your aerobic max, your VO2 max system can clear, or this system is too less to get rid of the pyruvate. That's the basic analysis of the two energy systems. Let me go into a little deeper so you fully understand that you have to balance these two systems to go faster, longer. It's noted right now that in addition to O2, fat and protein is metabolized here. Oftentimes, you know, when you go on a really easy ride, a regenerative ride, maybe it's a ride way less than your lactate threshold. You've heard of that term. I'll get into that in just a minute. You're teaching the system to burn fat. This is where nutrition comes into play to create all of the fat metabolizing enzymes that your body needs. Those enzymes are built through nutrition, not through riding easy. This is why Chris Frome, four-time winner of the Tour de France, has been winning. He's well known for a ketogenic diet. He's on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And the reason he's doing that is so that he builds up these fat-burning enzymes so that his aerobic system can be increased. He doesn't have to rely as much on pyruvate. And so what you get out of these systems is in this graph. This is intensity, easy, hard. You have, when fat metabolizes less, pyruvate goes up, and vice versa. Science has proven when you're at and you're using this system, going way easy, relying on fat, pyruvate is just not even produced. It's like this amount of stored carbohydrates that you have in your body, about 1,400 to 2,000 calories for most athletes stored. And you're in low intensity, you're saving it as long as fat is producing the energy source. The key is over time to train these two systems to eat in a certain way, which in subsequent videos I'll get into, so that this crossing point is at a higher intensity. And this is why Chris Frome is able to do so well on a ketogenic diet, as well as all endurance athletes can. So Chris Frome has been able to rely more on fat, less on pyruvate at upper intensities. Now don't get me wrong, Chris Frome is definitely using carbohydrates in the race. But outside of the race, in training rides, my guess is Chris Frome is in training rides, is in his low intensity zone. He's not even probably consuming carbohydrates. His aerobic system is so strong because not only his oxygen system is up, so is his ability to metabolize fat. Now let me get into the last part of this discussion, and it's the lactate curve. And let me just draw a little graph here. This is lactate. Let me get that where it's thicker. Lactate. And this is intensity or speed. Faster is this way. More lactate this way. So on a lactate curve, on the lactate curve, this is what happens. At lower intensities, in other words, at lower intensity where pyruvate isn't being really jammed down in this system and your VO2 max can clear it, if somebody took blood lactate testing, this is where science comes into play, and they'd take a graph at this is the level of lactate. And over a period, if they just did this, in other words, there's not lactate building up, the two systems, at least to that point, are balanced. And then as intensity increases, you're going to get a ride like this to where you max out. So that curve looks like this on the lactate curve for at least this athlete. This point right here, where lactate starts to accumulate. This is the term that most coaches in America call this the lactic threshold. And obviously it's at a higher intensity. And then after that, you could only go for so long where acidosis is going to stop you in your tracks. And then if you went all out as hard as you could go, where you couldn't go anymore, this would be the amount of lactate produced. So this, if you take a blood lactate test, this right here tells you the strength of your anaerobic system. In part, this, where that curve starts to go up, is an indication of your VO2 max. Blood lactate alone cannot determine your VO2 max. You can only do that through the gas analysis, where you have the mask on and you're breathing, you're breathing in air and out carbon dioxide. But here, blood lactate testing can tell at what steady state, and then it starts to rise, and so this would be your race intensity. Now the desirable outcome for any athlete, let me get orange, is to move the lactate curve, if you're an endurance athlete, to the right. In other words, let's say you did enough training, you're training these both systems correctly in the right intensity and the right volume, and you went 6-8 weeks later and you did another test, and let's say that your steady state was here and then it started to rise. Okay? So let's look at this curve for just a minute, conceptualize with me. So this system was improved during this training because lactate is higher. than it was before. Because your lactic threshold intensity went from this speed to this speed, you're now able to go faster without the buildup. So this would be your race intensity versus over here, because you train these systems correctly. This is the beauty of blood lactate testing and the science behind it. One last thing, just to give you another perception of this. In your base training, if you did a test and this is where you were at, and yet base training is where you might be building this system, you might be going hard, or maybe you're gonna ride Ironman Wisconsin with the big hills to where you really gotta have some lactate. You may actually want the lactate curve to come over here. As an example, let's say you blood lactate test, and this is what you got, okay? So the LT is a little bit less, the curve moved to the left, but lactate was higher. So this is a prime example of moving your system, making this stronger relatively than this, as in comparison to the blue lactate curve. In a subsequent video, I'm going to be teaching you what these mean. I'm going to go into great detail. I'll even show you my own work with this. And more importantly, how to use blood lactate testing to set your zones. And I'm going to show you some peer-reviewed papers and a video by Steven Seiler that talks about specific intensities to train these zones. And where more athletes get into what Steven Seiler calls the black hole. And this is where I was trained by a coach, one Ironman in the black hole, and all it did was to cause me to not train either one of these systems. In other words, when you train too easy, you lower this. When you can train too hard, you lower this. So my systems got decreased. I was dead tired all the time because that coach had me always training at a lactate threshold, and that did not work. And this is where I went to blood lactate testing using the science of me figuring out my zones. If you would subscribe down below with the subscribe button, and at least you'll be notified when I produce these extra videos. You take care, train good, race fast. Take care. Bye now.